kind of hold off my intro for a second, but really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. And let's see here. Give it a few more seconds for all of our attendees to get in the room. Great. So I want to be as respectful to the chairwoman's time as possible. So we're going to hop right in here today. So to start, my name is Michael Green. I'm the Director of Climate and Energy Policy over at the American Sustainable Business Council. ASBC has been working really closely with the Social Venture Circle, or SVC, to iron out a strategic relationship between the two organizations. So really excited to be bringing both of our members, memberships and groups together for this really exciting conversation at a really pertinent time as well. So what's going on with climate and energy policy? How can American businesses continue to be leaders in this conversation and driving for ambitious action are just some of the topics that we're going to get to touch on today. It's not every day that we get to sit down with someone who has just such an amazing insight and illustrious career working around these issues, and has been a great partner with American Sustainable Business Council and a lot of our businesses who want to see an engagement between policymakers and businesses in addressing the climate crisis in a way that's equitable, just, and really bold at this point in critical time. So one of the things that we're making sure that we ask everyone to take part in is we're actually putting together a sign-on to support the Build Back Better agenda. So we're going to drop that in the chat. If your business hasn't signed on already, please do. I think today is more or less the last day where we can show support for this ambitious agenda. So it's really, really critical that you do such. Today's conversation is actually capping off a week of Climate Week for us. And many of you have joined me in conversations with our congressmen and women and staffers up on the Hill, calling for this ambitious agenda to be a priority moving forward and making sure that we really line up American leadership in preparation of the coming up of the climate negotiations in Glasgow, Scotland. So really thankful to be looking to the White House and the federal administration for some of their leadership and also ways that we can be helpful in supporting that agenda going into this critical time in Congress, but also this critical time in international policy as well. And we're going to get really a great opportunity to hear insights from one of the foremost leaders on this topic within the administration. So Chairwoman Mallory, Brenda Mallory, was confirmed by the United States Senate on April 14th in 2021, sworn in as the 12th chair of the Council of Environmental Quality within the White House. She is the first African-American to serve in this position. And as chair, she advises the president on environment and natural resource policies that improve, preserve, and protect, a lot of P's in there, public health and the environment for American communities. She's focused particularly on addressing environmental justice and climate changes that the nation faces while advancing opportunities for job growth and economic development. But most importantly, she lives just outside the Beltway with her husband, is really a big fan of getting out and enjoying nature. So as a Vermonter, have a lot of respect for the values overlap there. Chairwoman Mallory, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to send it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Michael. Thank you for that warm introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just so thrilled to be here and to have the chance to sort of touch base with you today. But before I jump in, I want to recognize the important role that the American Sustainable Business Council plays, and to thank you and your member organizations for your collective action on climate change. We need you. And we're grateful for the commitment that we've received so far. So I think this is just really a great time for me to be here and to just underscore that point. For a few minutes today, my few minutes today, I'll focus on some of the key elements of President Biden's agenda to transition to a clean energy economy, with a particular emphasis on the federal sustainability program and our overall goal to lead by example. Then I'll provide an overview of some of the key features of the environmental justice work and the integral role that it plays in our efforts to tackle climate change. I am tremendously honored to work in an administration that is prioritizing climate action, the transition to a clean energy economy, and environmental justice. And every day, some impactful work in one of these areas is announced. This week alone, EPA announced a new program phasing down hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. CEQ launched the Greening of the Government initiative, through which countries around the world can share techniques for decarbonizing their operations. And the president launched an initiative to protect workers and communities from extreme heat. These actions and many others remind me of the moment we're in and the opportunity we have to really make a difference on the ground. The president recently traveled to the New York and New Jersey area and saw the devastation to the communities from extreme weather events, this time from Hurricane Ida. He then traveled to the West Coast to assess the human, physical, and economic toll of rampant wildfires on impacted communities. As the president said, this is a code red situation. But President Biden, who's an optimist, has always noted that while the climate poses a real crisis and a threat, it also presents us with an enormous opportunity to create 21st century jobs, to innovate at an unprecedented level, and to advance environmental justice across the country. These goals are integral to President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure deal and his Build Back Better agenda. In particular, the bipartisan infrastructure deal will, number one, strengthen the resilience of physical and natural systems, including Western water systems, improve wildfire preparedness, resilience, and response, including funding for smart forest management and resources to treat and restore millions of acres of high-risk areas, and to make our communities safer and more resilient to the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events. And further, President Biden's Build Back Better agenda will address the underlying causes of climate change. The president's plan identifies three approaches: reducing greenhouse gas emissions through clean energy tax cuts that incentivize and accelerate the deployment of technology and innovation, establishing a clean electricity performance plan that will send a market signal to bring private investment off the sidelines and create the framework to meet the president's goal of 100% clean electricity by 2035. And finally, establishing a civilian conservation corps. Our charge is to think broadly and inclusively about how to transition our energy sector in ways that improve the quality of all Americans' lives now and for decades to come. So we have a remarkable opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives at this point. And at the White House, we are implementing the agenda through a whole of government approach to all of these issues, because the president knows that taking decisive action now will allow the United States to reap the economic benefits of the clean energy revolution. Indeed, as the world's largest purchaser of goods and services, the federal government has a significant role in shaping markets, creating jobs, and bringing innovative technologies to scale. Because of this, President Biden set ambitious federal sustainability goals early in his administration. He directed the federal government to transition to carbon pollution-free electricity no later than 2035, and move our fleet to zero emission vehicles. The president recognizes that with a footprint of more than 300,000 buildings, over 600,000 vehicles, and $650 billion spent annually on goods and services, the federal government has a unique opportunity to dramatically and equitably influence our country's climate future. The federal chief sustainability officer located within the Council on Environmental Quality is leading the development of a comprehensive federal sustainability plan. Through our plan, we will improve energy and water efficiency in our buildings and dramatically reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the federal procurement and supply chain. Our plan also will leverage domestic and international partnerships to accelerate our progress, including through the newly launched Green Government Initiative. The Biden-Harris administration knows that with so much at stake and so much in common, the case for mutual support and cooperation among nations is paramount. It is with that spirit that together with the Canadian government, we launched a new first of its kind forum to advance greening government operations around the world. This week, we had the first official meeting of this partnership, the Greening Government Initiative. More than 50 countries from Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and Europe came together to learn how their fellow countries are transitioning national fleets to zero emission vehicles, electrifying and enhancing the resilience of government buildings, and establishing sustainable procurement policies. Let me turn now to environmental justice. Since day one, President Biden and Vice President Harris have made addressing environmental justice and equity central pillars of the administration's agenda. The administration has committed to incorporate equity for historically overburdened and underserved communities throughout our policy initiatives. In order to implement such a change, President Biden created the first ever White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. The council is made up of 26 longtime environmental justice advocates and experts from all across the country. President Biden also established the first ever White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council, which is composed of senior leaders from key agencies. I'm honored to chair this council. These tools facilitate a whole of government approach to pursue environmental justice. That means, for example, asking all federal agencies to evaluate the accessibility and impact of their programs on low-income communities and communities of color, and ensuring that all communities receive the intended benefits. Equally important, President Biden set a historic goal to deliver 40% of the overall benefits from relevant federal investments in clean energy and infrastructure to historically disadvantaged communities. Excuse me. We call this the Justice 40 Initiative. This brings me to our collective role as we meet today and how we can work together to deliver on this vision and imperative. The questions we must answer are, how do we build out clean energy in a better way? How do we effectively leverage the advancements that have already occurred? How do we incentivize the necessary partnerships? How do we make sure our federal investments are actually reaching the communities they are designed to help? And how do we ensure everyone can reap the benefits from the clean energy economy? That is our challenge, and we can do this with partners like you. Whether it's state and local officials leading the way from Michigan to New York to New Mexico, or businesses finding innovative solutions to their complex problems, all of us must work together. So this is my ask of you. Work with us so that together we can build out an equitable clean energy economy. Thank you for the strong support ASBC has voiced for the Build Back Better agenda. To individual companies, if you haven't already, articulate your near-term climate goals. If you support the Build Back Better agenda, say so. And then say it again to fellow CEOs and folks in your community. If you support some of the Build Back Better agenda, say so. Solving the climate crisis is the challenge of our lifetimes, and it is going to take all of us to work together. So together, let's transition to a clean energy economy that everyone can benefit from. Thank you for the work you do, and thanks for inviting me to join you today. I'm happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman, for joining us and for those remarks. As far as it goes, looking through my notes, and there is a lot there to be thinking about and kind of chewing on as we continue to try and find ways to partner and be supportive. But leveraging the partnerships within ASBC and SVC, we represent around 250,000 businesses across the country, and partner and affiliate groups at the state level and local level nationally. So we're certainly there to be supportive of that. Investments reaching communities. I think the business community plays such a key role there, especially local and independent businesses, in being supportive of making sure that that technology and investments can reach communities, and also bringing, of course, those same technologies to scale into market at the speed and the drive that's needed because of the climate crisis right now. If that's not a problem that speaks to the opportunity of American ingenuity, I don't know what is. And I think it's really a great call to action, things that we will continue to look to partner with your office and with the administration on. Earlier in your remarks, and also previously throughout your career, you've been a champion of environmental justice at the local level. And you started out with talking a little bit about the president's stops to communities that have felt the impacts of climate catastrophes. But there's also the communities, as you very well know, that are dealing with it every single day. They don't need a hurricane or a fire or a flood to know that they're feeling the threats of climate change and of environmental justice. So why are some of the most egregious polluting industries, from your previous work and understanding, in the communities that they are? And how, as business leaders, can we support those communities?
That's such a great question. And I really appreciate your underscoring that notion that for some people, it doesn't take an extreme event for them to really be suffering with some of these impacts, particularly flooding, which is one of the major events every day, every week, every time it rains. So I guess I would say, in my mind, it all comes down to power and the lack of it. A lot of the communities that have become what people refer to as sacrifice zones are located in places where there is little financial and political power to prevent facilities from locating there. And once you start to have facilities there, there's almost a domino effect. It becomes easier to stay there. It becomes easier to get the zoning. It becomes easier to have some sense that, well, actually, that's where they go because that's where they've started. And the result of that is that, the populations, some of whom, arrived before the businesses showed up. I know there's been some notion in the past that, people moved to these communities where there were facilities that had the impacts that they do. That's not the way it often happens. I was just recently in Michigan and in the zip code that is apparently the most polluted zip code in Michigan, which I don't have memorized. But anyway, in visiting that was an example of a community that had been sort of a basic working class community, stores, groceries, just basically what you would expect in a community. And then one company moved in, and slowly but surely what it was is basically an area that is a lot of industrial entities, and some people were bought out. Interestingly enough, that was also done along racial lines, but other people were not, and they're there and they're suffering with those. And so, our legacy of segregation in this country has affected our housing patterns. And that also plays into kind of where these areas are. The federal government's major effort on highway systems had a very significant effect in terms of bifurcating communities of color, an issue that the more you read into that is really, in some ways for me, was surprising. I started kind of a sort of a journey on this topic, reading the book, The Color of Law, which I highly recommend to everyone, because it is a really powerful statement about just the integration of the various laws across our country, federal government largely, but then in parts of the chapters, it kind of goes down to local zoning, restrictive covenants and property deeds, and all of these things kind of fit together to create some of the communities and to restrict people to communities that now are suffering most. So, that's, I think, what we mean when we talk about institutional equity issues, right? It's not one thing, it's not one, it hasn't happened over some short time. There's a number of factors that build on each other that have resulted in the location. And now that the location is there, the question is like, what do you do? Like, how do you help these people? How do you address what they're suffering every day? And like when I was in this Michigan neighborhood, which I'm sorry, I don't know the zip code, that, what folks were saying there was like, what they wanted and help that they wanted was having some type of funding that would help them deal with the health problems that are like rampant in the community. Having some mechanism to ensure that the facilities were there have to meet the requirements, the permitting requirements that they already have. And, just things like that to kind of try to minimize what is a daily harm for these folks.
I think as far as our role as businesses and in trying to be partnered and supportive, certainly something at ASBC we've tried to champion, and we actually had several members of the EJ Advisory Council join us in meetings earlier this week on the Hill, and trying to help champion the communities that they work with and represent is one way that we can leverage our voice as businesses, right? Because there's a certain way that we get listened to, or a role that we're able to play in the fabric of society here in America as CEOs and entrepreneurs and executives. And if we can use that leverage point for some of the communities that are feeling this every single day, that should be a strategic, priority, I think, within our organization and all of our businesses, and it's something ASBC is working to champion. And we'll get into other ways that, the American businesses can be leaders, but I'm always curious to critique our leadership, right? I read on a sign recently that a experienced sailor doesn't gain his experience from smooth seas, right? And so constantly being able to critique, evaluate, and challenge that leadership for us is really important. Where do you see the kind of the blind spots or areas that the American business leaders aren't thinking about enough as it relates to the agenda in the climate crisis?
Yeah, great question. And let me just start off by kind of underscoring the things you just said, because I do feel like that the recognition that the business community just has such a tremendous role. Like government cannot solve these problems without that partnership that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And businesses within their own communities have tremendous influence and power. And I think that is huge in terms of recognizing the breadth of your reach and your power. I guess a couple of things I would say, some companies have already started out thinking about their own footprint on where they are specifically in a particular community or in a particular location. But I would just encourage you to think beyond yourself and think about your supply chain. Think about the others that are very central part of the work that you do and what their attitudes and approaches are to kind of examining the environmental justice issues and the impacts that that their work is having on communities that are nearby. I think that would be value add significantly. The second thing is I would say, data and transparency are tremendously powerful. And I know many, well, I won't say many, but I know some companies are definitely looking at how they examine and do in kind of a, in a reporting fashion, examining how they interact with their communities, where they're located, figuring out like what their issues are. And doing that in a way that collected data and made it available would be hugely valuable. I mean, one of the examples that we often use about the power of information is the toxic release inventory, which EPA has. And, the existence of this database and information about toxic chemicals being within a community has served a really valuable point where, companies don't want to have to say that they've got these chemicals that are, next door to the elementary school. And so it encourages people to think about whether or not there are different approaches to some of their operations that's useful. So I would say data and transparency, lean into that. And then, one of the things that, I've mentioned that we're doing, the environmental, the Justice 40 initiative, which is targeting certain programs to start as part of a pilot. I think a partnership around where those investments are going, where the federal government has agencies that are putting funds into a certain location, like whether or not that can be done in a way where the businesses in that area kind of also invest in that area so that there's a bigger accomplishment or bang for the buck, if you will, from the work that's going there. I think all of those things would be hugely valuable. And it also forces, I think each one of them in a different way, kind of forces companies to get out of the mode where they may be talking about these issues more, which I think is a very important first step, but that they haven't quite gotten beyond to specific actions. And so just finding the ways to kind of move the talk to the action, I think is really critical.
We don't have any more time for talk. We only have time for action right now. And I appreciate that sentiment, absolutely. Speaking of time, do we have time for one more question with you? If it's
sure. Yeah, I can do it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And so, the last question, speaking of timing and looking forward into the tight window that we face here, I applaud the doubling of climate finance pledge from the Biden administration earlier this week. I think that is really a great way to demonstrate American leadership. But going into the climate negotiations in Glasgow, where Kylan, who we'll be able to hear from in a little bit, as well as several other ASBC members will be attending and joining the negotiations. Can you shine a light on some of the top priorities, and if there's ways that as American business leaders that are going to be present, is there ways that we can be supportive and hopefully work together to spur global action at this critical time?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that, some of the work that you all are already doing just in amplifying both the messages and the elements of the president's agenda that are so critical to this area, like carrying that activity into these discussions, I think would be very valuable. I think we need to show that this is not just the Joe Biden period, and that we're onto something that's not going to end with his presidency, whether that's 4 years or 8 years. I mean, I think people want to know that there is an investment being made by the country and the country's businesses that could be really powerful in showing that there's a commitment here in the United States to what's necessary to really meet this challenge. And in the last 4 years, we've seen a number of entities that have popped up doing that, like the America is All In coalition. Like that was really powerful, and that type of activity is really powerful. So I would say, the more that is done to amplify and show commitment to the things that we are identifying as priorities, and a willingness to do the businesses doing their part to actually make it a reality, no matter who's in the White House. I think that would be really valuable.
Absolutely. Chairwoman Mallory, I want to thank you so much for the time to speak with us and address our audience. there's so much to be said about your leadership individually and how that's been reflected in the administration's priorities. And I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you for your service and your committed prioritization, from your previous work molding into your current role. And I think that is just been really inspiring for those of us who have been pushing around environmental justice and around bold climate action in the advocacy world to see that starting to, transcend into the national leadership landscape in your work. So thank you so much for that. We have a lot now that we're going to hand it over to some panelists to continue to chew on, but we'll let you go and continue to think of us as partners in this agenda.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I can't stay, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Wow. Okay. That was phenomenal. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We're now going to turn it over to a couple of our member businesses who have been really driving the conversation here. So perfect, right on cue with your guys' cameras. This is wonderful, and thank you. Before people towards the end of this have to hop, I just want to say quick thanks to, of course, our panelists and folks at the CEQ that helped set this up, but also the team behind the scenes. Who have been so supportive in getting everybody together for this conversation, and Isaac and team, you guys, phenomenal job. Thank you so much. So we're joined by three illustrious guests who are going to get to respond to the chairwoman's remarks. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask, and then we're going to turn it over to the panelists and hopefully make this as conversational as possible. I'll give a brief intro to you each. But I'm going to ask that you guys keep your answers to some of these questions brief. There's three of you. There's a lot that we're going to want to get into. And hopefully, if you don't get that point in, we'll circle back to you. So just keep that in mind. So with that being said, who am I joined by? We are joined today by Kylan Atkins Irby. Kylan is one of our great members here at ASBC, very involved with the Climate and Energy Working Group, actively pushing me to think through policy and initiatives within our priority setting and strategic thought, as is Fran, I should say as well. He's kind of smiling. He's like, wait a second, I hassle you too. But, really excited to be in over in Glasgow with you, hopefully later this fall. So Kylan works over at Planet Forward, serves as the head of partnerships there. And so who is Planet Forward? They're a software company on a mission to empower the next generation of sustainable brands, harnessing big data and some of the things that Chairwoman was just talking about. So talk about like great relevant experience and work. We'll be able to immediately move in Kylan to talking to you a little bit about that. We're also going to hear from Fran Benedito over at Climate Trade. Also extremely relevant work as we think about transparency and reporting and what companies are doing for action now in order to reduce their carbon footprint. Fran has an MBA that he received in France and has been acknowledged as one of the top 100 worldwide fintech influencers in reaching our SDG goals. So the work over at Climate Trade is just super important and excited to go deep a little bit in there. And last but not least, Anthony Zolezzi is going to get to join us and hear a little bit about the work over at Delrata Corp. And when Anthony and I got to check in earlier this past month about his experience and background, one of the things that was just like amazing for me as someone who's only been in this work for about 15 years, is to hear about the cyclical nature of when we thought we had opportunities for impact. And Anthony has been able to kind of catch me up on things that were before I came to this space, and really harnessed the importance of the moment that we're in right now. His background in working with the corporate sector around sustainability and climate goals is, really amazing, and something that we're going to get to lean into here in our questions and conversation we're about to have. So the first question I have for the three of you, and maybe because this is how it shows up on my screen, Kylan, you can go first on this one. But the first question that I had was really looking at some of the priorities that the chairwoman lined out. And I'm kind of curious to your thoughts. Some of the things that she said that were really, really critical, looking back at my notes here, is the footprint in communities and supply chain, and taking action and understanding that. The use of data in transparency and its importance. And also this really unique piece that I'm not sure we've cracked quite yet, but the way we can have public and private partnership in the investment in those communities, which is something that's also extremely important. So, Kylan, maybe if you could just respond to some of her remarks, and then we'll kick it over to Fran and Anthony.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing everyone together. And that was great. Everything that Chairwoman said was really resonating. I think I actually, like, in prep for today and thinking about what I wanted to share, she hit on exactly some of the main topics, talking about data and transparency, and also the importance of moving from talk to action. I think are really some of the key topics that I think about with Planet Forward, and that we're trying to accelerate ourselves, specifically around creating more incentives for transparency, and also speeding up climate urgency, right? We have a lot of companies making commitments, but we really need to move towards action. And so my background is in ESG and impact investment before I started at Planet Forward. What we do at Planet Forward is we provide carbon assessment software for companies to make it super easy to get on a path to net zero. And we're really focused on driving emissions reductions throughout the supply chain, focused on consumer companies. But in my experience, there's a number of things that really drive companies to make decisions fast. That's, business risks, like true costs, true efficiency loss, true operational disruptions. There's regulatory scrutiny in terms of, regulations actually bearing down on companies. But then there's public scrutiny or really public incentives in terms of consumer awareness. And I think that's one piece that we could actually be leaning a lot farther into to help accelerate the actions that the government's taking, and accelerating the actions that are being taken in the private sector. I think one thing that we think about is this idea of carbon labeling, for example, which some huge companies in the private sector have started to lean into, such as Unilever committing to carbon label 70,000 of their products, Just Salad, the first in the food service industry to do that. And these are ways that we could start to leverage consumer awareness to drive more transparency on behalf of companies, and then create competitive incentives to reduce emissions without any true hard-hitting regulations or anything. That's just leveraging the systems that we already have in place. So that's one of the things that Planet Forward thinks about a lot, in terms of transparency being a catalyst to drive true emissions reductions through the supply chains, especially when we think about consumer products where there's a ton of power in the public.
Thank you so much for that. No, I think, if we could have a ban on long-term emission targets for companies to be setting as their ambitious action that they're taking now, I would appreciate that, because it's, coming out with just a goal now for where you want to be by 2050 just isn't enough. That's a 2008 or maybe even earlier kind of action or move to make. And really hats off to the team at Planet Forward for cracking this nut. And the challenges that I hear from businesses the most is that there's challenges around having full data and awareness to their supply chain and across their entire vertical through to, you know, their consumer. And I think we're getting to the point where consumer drive and consumer commitment is trickling up into shareholder commitment, which is then driving business action at the highest level. So thank you for the bite of the cake that you guys are going to play in solving that. Fran, I'm going to kick it over to you to hear, you know, some of your thoughts and remarks, you know, to Chairwoman Mallory's comments.
It was great to hear. Thank you, Michael. It was great to hear Chairman Mallory and also Kylan about talking about the carbon labeling, no? Because it's something that is going to be very important. Like every product that we know today is going to be labeled on carbon future. We were the first carbon API worldwide in order to be able to offset from origin or in the destination by the end user that product or service, flights, rooms, anything that you may imagine. We are now working on gas stations to with big brands in order to compensate the carbon footprint by the end user. No? But what I really like the most on the approach of Mrs. Mallory, it is like the Biden. I really like the approach of the Biden administration to the situation. We need to change the way we have the infrastructure, like the energy infrastructure in the US. If we put all that investment on the infrastructure and switch to renewable energy, to clean energy, we'll be able to create new jobs and create new progress for the country in that change, in that path. And really is very important today that because the solution is public and private, as Mrs. Mallory was saying, no? This is a solution that the corporate sector needs to embrace, because we are talking that we need conscious capitalism today. We need conscious capitalism. We need more B Corps every time, more a movement that was created in the United States and many companies are embracing. And together with that, I think that the paper and the role of carbon markets designing that is also in the agenda is very relevant. What we saw from the beginning, we were back in 2017, and my partner has from 15 years ago working the carbon markets in the UN. What we are seeing, and especially, you know, European Union has a lot of regulation in the non-financial reporting, in the financial institutions, new regulations. What we see is that the carbon markets don't have, in my opinion, doesn't have to be only an ETS regulated market, because the voluntary market are very important also, because incentivizes the local action. No? So if you are able to incentivize local action, incentivize the companies to generate clean and energy and generate green projects that can bring all that richness to the local communities, that's a way that we can incentivize the shift in the total economy. It's not only about energy, which is the most important because we take rid of the fossil fuels or we switch to renewable energy. It is about decarbonization, also about projects that do that, and that could be done in local. No?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And anyone who's followed some of my previous research and work knows my strong belief and support for ambitious carbon pricing schemes and for the first point, making polluters pay for the damage and continued damage that they're having on our communities and on our climate, but also the importance that it's going to yield in creating opportunities to invest, right, through carbon markets through climate finance. Is new technology deployment as well, and something that we're very closely monitoring at ASBC, and a lot of our businesses care a lot about. And the opportunity of investment that Chairwoman Mallory brought up in supporting private and public partnerships through that investment is really important in the way that I think, at least, an equitable and just carbon market can be designed as well, right? Because that's where your innovation and your best opportunity for uplifting communities is going to come through that kind of partnership, while also driving fossil fuel industry to pay for the damages that they've done historically and continues to do. Absolutely supportive and with you there. So we've talked a little bit about the footprint and supply chain and tracking and data and the importance of data and transparency, as well as the public and private partnership importance. Kick it over to you, Anthony, Mr. Zalesi, to talk to us a little bit more about your thoughts on Chairwoman Mallory's comments.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is this is probably the most encouraging panel and words from the chairwoman that I've heard in the last 30 years working on these topics. So I'm very encouraged. And if I don't say anything and the panel dropped off right now, I would leave very encouraged and very positive, which brings me to one place. You know, when in 2006, when Inconvenient Truth was launched, you know, I thought, wow, we can really rally around this. And on a global stage, I got with Prince Charles and we produced the movie Harmony to show the impact of deforestation and did the book Harmony. And we tried to do all these things, but we weren't coalescing. I just didn't feel like things were clicking. But today, I think the thing that we can't do is miss this opportunity of confluence. I mean, the intelligence that Fran and Kylan just speak about right now has never been spoken before. We haven't had those tools. So to me, I think we've never seen a time like this. I think we have to act. I think the most encouraging thing about Climate Week was do it now. Let's not wait. And I think, you know, the most important thing for me, Delrata, I'm charged with the sustainability strategy for the company, and the company wants to do new and different technologies, and they've got technologies that are unique. But unfortunately, sometimes your history is baggage, right? It's not always good. But I do go back to reflect in the organic food industry and what we struggled with there. I do go back and look at sustainability and how we struggled. I struggled with Pepsi. I struggled with waste management. I struggled with many of these large companies to try and actually get them involved in sustainability. But what we had to do was actually provide a technology or provide a product, and we did do that. We reshaped the entire recycling system with a small group of us, and we sold it to Waste Management. And right now, I'm trying to say, where does Delrata play? And I think one thing that is different is in all the previous movements I've been in, we've said, big food, you're bad. Organic food, you're wonderful. But by pushing away big food, I think we really hurt ourselves. So one thing I'm looking at is Delrata, is there a way that we can embrace fossil fuel, or at least clean fossil fuel, and make it 7 to 8 times more efficient? Mm-hmm. If we have technologies, and we're building those technologies at Delrata right now, and I just heard today that it's actually working, which is very exciting. But you know, can we embrace and then say, look, everyone can stay attached to the grid. You want to keep the grid just for insurance, make you feel better. But let's get these technologies in that can make that grid 7 to 8 times more efficient. And then we take the longevity of that fossil fuel out that many more years. I think there might be something there. I'm not saying it's something, it's a work in progress, but I do think that's somewhat of a miss from everything that I've heard, is you can't just walk away from the basic industry that's been serving you. You've got to figure out a way to transition. And if you look at every major movement, there's a transition period. And unfortunately, we just haven't really initiated a transition. So I'd say, let's transition and make fossil fuel more efficient, and then measure and make companies accountable. The measuring the decarbonization, Kylan and Fran, as you guys know, there can't be anything more than measuring and making these companies accountable. The footprint, no one's really made any of these companies accountable. And so we really need to do that. And I think we can. And then number 3, the third thing that we're really working with at Delrata is, look, there's only one way this will really happen. And that's if we activate the human spirit. And I think we can do that individually. I think we're at that precipice to make this happen. So I think my word is, let's not take this moment for granted. I've been waiting 30 years for it, and I feel it. I jumped out of biotech to get back involved because it was happening. And, I'm excited about it, but I do really think that we need to push this forward and push it together, push it forward faster, quicker, faster than I've ever thought about. And Kylan, you said about building on all of the federal programs. I couldn't agree more because, although there's so many programs, they'll fall flat if the private sector doesn't jump in there and amplify them. So I'm just very encouraged, Michael, and excited to be here. And, I'm an old guy. I'm excited to be able to have a seat at the table. So thank you.
Absolutely, sir. No, and one of the things that I would offer, and I would say to back your remarks up, I think absolutely that industry should play a role in the transition and in new innovation and technology. But really, I'm also a staunch believer in capitalism. And at the end of the day, conscious capitalism would dictate that they would see the writing on the wall there, and they themselves are the ones that need to innovate and change and adapt to the moment, and find those new technologies. And I know many, many are. So you brought up a great point, Anthony, around the use of public policy. And I am just going to immediately default to my working group chair, where all I like to do is walk out. And if you haven't joined to our meetings, they're the third Thursday of every month. We'll make sure you get an invite. But we like to focus and pay attention to public policy and where can we have impact and what is missing and what can be additive or what needs to change. And one of the reasons why is because so often policy is created in the ivory tower up on Capitol Hill with those who have influence, and it not nearly enough is actually brought to the businesses that are going to feel the impact or have the opportunity. So we're just going to stick here with the order because I'm boring and not creative enough to maybe change it up. But my question specifically, Kylan, is going to be, what are some of the things in the Build Back agenda that are possibly maybe missing, or pieces that are in there that you think are going to move the needle most for your business and for your industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think by and large, the most important piece to Planet Forward and probably to most American businesses is the clean energy aspects of the Build Back Better plan. We work with companies to calculate their carbon footprint. We work specifically or most often with consumer products companies. And I will say that almost 90% of most consumer products companies are scope 3 emissions when it comes down to your overall carbon footprint. So, getting our grid to clean energy is going to reduce every single company's scope 1 and 2 emissions significantly, which is huge and incredibly important. However, when we think about net zero commitments, you do see the majority of companies setting scope 1 and 2 emissions targets because they think that's what's most directly in their control. However, scope 3 is oftentimes the largest percentage for most companies. So what would be missing to me is not only kind of more accountability for scope 3 emissions reductions, but additionally, and I'm actually really curious to hear Fran's thoughts on this, the reality of what most companies are doing is offsetting for the remainder, right? That's what the majority of companies are doing right now when we think about achieving net zero or getting to carbon neutrality. It's really outsized action being done to offset as opposed to reduce, which 100% needs to change from an ethos perspective. But if that is what businesses are going to be doing, then I would just like for that to be, let's allocate those dollars to be impactful, to have the impact that they're supposed to have. So if we're going to be purchasing offsets, we need more standardization around the actual efficacy of those offset projects. They need to be truly additional. Like the investment that goes into the development of an offset project needs to ensure that the emissions reductions that result from that investment would not have occurred otherwise. It needs to be actually measurable. It needs to be actually permanent, because otherwise we're taking credit for climate action that we're not actually doing. So I think that that's one huge piece for me that keeps me up at night that I would like to see addressed further. But I think that, clean energy is obviously a huge step and a big thing, but that would be next for sure.
Fran, I'm sure you agree, but please, the same question. You can
I
build.
really like to hear that for Kylan, and it's exciting the talking here, the discussion here. Like basically, we've been working on this since many years. So what I totally agree with Kylan, but I go one step further. The problem with the carbon markets is that before you didn't have transparency, traceability towards the funds. So you didn't know if that were generating positive impact or not, if the developer was receiving the fair price or not. And obviously it's very relevant in the term of additionality, because obviously the high quality and the CCP, we've been working on the recent task force created by McKinsey and some of the biggest organizations in the carbon space worldwide. We were present there. We were experts on that, on different groups. So basically, what is important is to introduce new technologies. As the Paris Agreement states in Article 6, and at the very end, you need to introduce new technologies to provide efficiency, logic, transparency, traceability. So we introduced blockchain to the equation. No? Climate Trade was the first company to create a carbon marketplace that allows developers to contact directly to corporates and justify, clarify, and provide traceability of the funds toward the origin. That's why I was saying before, we need to act in local. The money has to go to the pocket of the developers, and that has to be proven, no? And that has to be generating a real impact, no? And that we have other measures, like obviously additionality. It is key also here, because that project, as Kylan said, couldn't be developed without the influence of that money coming from the carbon taxes and carbon offsetting. But what Kylan was mentioning also is this is not about carbon offsetting. Totally right. I mean, this is about the company setting up the right strategy, reducing and making the efficiency, making the changes and the efficient moves in order to do not have to offset that much. No? And that's why it's important, the ETS, and that's why it's important, the voluntary markets. The ETS cap and trade is all about efficiency of the companies in setting and developing newer strategies to reduce emissions. The voluntary market goes in the scope that the ETS doesn't go. I mean, ETS normally is for the most polluting sectors, but what about the other ones? How do you incentivize the other companies, the citizens, to generate new ways to decarbonize and to tackle climate change? And that's all about that. Sorry for being that, to do it that long. Huh?
No, I think it's helpful, any policies that we can push in the agenda that support a carbon market that is transparent, just, and equitable is something that we are going to be following up because of that important role it does play in economy-wide decarbonization, not just necessarily in the heaviest polluting industries. In most of our states that have already switched our energy portfolio over are actively doing such. Most of the carbon footprint in the country is coming from housing and transportation, right? Not just necessarily point source polluters. So hear you loud and clear on that, and we'll be sure to continue to keep people updated in the working group on that conversation to give you guys some bait and more reason to join. So Anthony, over to you, sir. What's missing from the agenda, or what are you on the lookout for that is going to help move the needle the most within Dalrada?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been working on for the last 6 or 7 months is, can we, and I'm just going to jump to it quick because I know we're out of time. We can create something like Green Harmony. So it's literally a dating app for our businesses, because, if I've got a business and I can't get my carbon this much lower, but I can join with a regenerative agriculture company or even a small group of farmers. And so can I swipe left and swipe left and find partners that can help me? And it's not really an offset, it's partnering to get to net zero. And so I'm calling it like a net zero collective. Can we form a collective of companies that have the same goal and are willing to do the work and put those companies together so that they're offset? It might take 4 or 5 companies to get the right offset. So that's just one other thing that I'm thinking about and that we're working on.
I love that idea. And as Sierra, a great ally in the audience, just commented, for those of you on dating apps, it's swipe right to the ones that you love, not necessarily swipe left. But the idea holds
well, obviously,
true.
I've never been on one, so I don't know.
No, it's great. I think you're dead on with that. Folks, unfortunately, I know there's a lot of questions in the chat, and I had a few more here that I was hoping to get to, but we're out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the chat, and I'm going to share it with our panelists. So please make sure you throw in your information now if you haven't already, if you've asked the question, so that way we can appropriately reach out to you. But with that, I just want to thank the three of you for taking the time to sit down with us. I know Climate Week is busy. You all are traveling and getting pulled in a lot of directions. But, you know, next week, guess what? It's also going to be Climate Week. We're not taking our foot off the gas here at American Sustainable Business Council. Please make sure to sign the Build Back Better pledge if you haven't already. That's going to be an instrumental tool for us showing American business support for ambitious climate action going forward. We're going to continue to be a resource for you all as the Build Back Better agenda moves through Congress and hopefully ends up on the president's desk. Through our collaboration, through our continued support and working together, we're going to be able to get that done. So I know the news and maybe others have been lukewarm on it, but I strongly believe in the optimism on this call and our ability as American businesses to stand up with creativity, ingenuity, drive, and commitment to address this crisis. Thank you all for the time. Again, my name is Michael Green. Feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Kylan. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Anthony. Thanks, everyone.